Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for tuning in to today's event. My name is Will Tanner, and I am the Director of Onward, a think tank whose mission it is to renew the centre-right for the next generation by coming up with bold and practical new policy ideas and reaching out to new groups of people. And today's event really gets to the heart of that mission, because let's face it, the events of the last few months, the last few years, have exposed the pressing need for government to think about the way in which it does things, potentially to change some of the ways it does things, and to embrace new thinking. Since we set up Onward in 2018, we have been perennially struck, wherever we go, by the sheer number of people who feel like the system perhaps isn't working for them, and who feel like the system perhaps doesn't reflect their priorities. In places as diverse as Bridgend and Dereham, as diverse as Glasgow and Grimsby, from Workington to Watford, we hear the same story. People desperately want change, and last December they voted for it. In the months since that historic realignment, the pandemic has served as a further reminder of the things that we perhaps haven't been as prepared for as we might have been, and some of the systems that might not work as well as they should do. But it's also been a great accelerator in the sense that it has forced us to do things differently. It's allowed innovation to happen at pace and at scale that were unimaginable just a few months ago. And it's brought enormous benefits and comfort at a time of great difficulty. And the challenge now is then to learn from some of those lessons and to harness that desire for change. And that's precisely what we're here to discuss today. And I'm very proud, and I'm especially grateful that Onward is hosting the first policy speech by the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Steve Barclay, ahead of what promises to be a historic spending review this autumn. In his work on the Public Accounts Committee, as Economic Secretary in the Treasury, where we are today, and as Brexit Secretary in roles before this role, Steve has been a tireless advocate for the public interest and a fierce agitator for change. And so before I hand over to Steve, I just want to do a few housekeeping rules. The first is, if you have questions, if you have comments, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I will be doing a Q&A session with Steve after his remarks, and I will do my best to ask as many questions as I can. If we could ensure that those questions are on the task at hand rather than broader politics, that would be appreciated. And secondly, I will be closing this session at 3:30 p.m. to protect the Chief Secretary's diary and to protect all of your diaries. So just to give you that commitment from me before we begin. But without further ado, because his words are much more important than mine, I'm delighted to introduce the person who has the kind of unenviable job of steering the country back to fiscal sustainability and economic recovery over the coming months, Steve Barclay.
Well, thank you very much, Will, for that kind introduction. Good afternoon to those that have joined in. And it's a real pleasure to be giving my first policy speech as Chief Secretary to the Treasury ahead of the spending review this autumn. Today I'll be speaking about how the Treasury can be an accelerator of change in government. And so it's fitting to be hosted by Onward, who for the past year and a half have been leading the renewal of ideas on the centre-right of British politics. A spending review is a significant moment in the life cycle of a government. We must not only conduct this review against the backdrop of the most challenging peacetime economic circumstances in living memory, we must do so as the government re-elected a little over 7 months ago with a strengthened majority and an emboldened mandate. Now, these two factors are not mutually exclusive. Over the past few weeks, the Prime Minister, Chancellor and the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster have each delivered speeches outlining how our recovery from this pandemic can be a moment for national renewal. But as Chief Secretary, my role is to talk less about the what and to focus more on the how. So today I want to explore how the spending review can act as the mechanism to deliver the Prime Minister's ambition to level up our country. Now, this practical approach is rooted in my experience at different stages of my political career. As a constituency MP, I have on many occasions run up against a system that is slow and siloed. In frustration, I found myself asking why there is a 7-year gap between funding being agreed for a road scheme and the first digger arriving, or why it takes a decade to decide to produce a full business case, and whether to reopen 8 miles of railway track, taking twice the length of time of the Second World War. As Will said, before becoming a minister, I sat on the Public Accounts Committee for 4 years, where reports repeatedly showed schemes where the outcomes did not reflect the inputs. As an example, 9 regional fire control centres were built at a cost of £750 million. Not one of them worked. The lack of upfront clarity on outcomes, the slow speed of delivery, and the variable quality of data have been familiar themes during those years. And this spending review is an opportunity to challenge this. But first, it's worth considering the context for what, as Will says, will be the first multi-year review since 2015. And given my previous role, it perhaps won't surprise you if I start with Brexit. For me, Brexit was a vote for change by people who felt the status quo was not delivering for them. But now we must deliver, particularly for those who at the election lent us their votes for the first time. And we must deliver differently in the wake of a crisis that has accelerated many trends within our economy and our society. Take healthcare. Before coronavirus, around 95% of GP consultations were face-to-face. By the end of April, this had almost reversed, with more than 85% taking place remotely, either by phone or online. And few GPs now say they want to return to the old approach. Whitehall has also had to change. The furlough scheme was announced by the Chancellor on the 20th of March and opened for applications just 1 month later to the day. Likewise, the self-employed income support scheme opened almost a whole month ahead of schedule. Normally, such schemes take months, years even, to deliver. And HMRC achieved this with more than 80% of their staff working from home. I'd like to put on record my thanks to the civil servants in the Treasury, HMRC and elsewhere for the speed and focus with which they have tackled these extraordinary challenges. But if the wheels of government can be made to spin this fast in a crisis, with all the added pressure of lockdown, why can't it happen routinely? For example, why did it have to take a pandemic to collect the right information to understand who are the most clinically vulnerable people in our society? Indeed, would we have been able to collect the necessary data without the backdrop of a health emergency? Answering these questions will not only help us to deal with the consequences of COVID-19, it also cuts to the heart of this government's defining mission to level up investment and opportunity across the country. Now, I think most people understand that the action we are taking to support businesses and jobs during this pandemic is the right thing to do, even though it does come at a significant cost. Indeed, as the OBR have made clear, the cost of inaction would have been far greater. The Prime Minister has made it clear that austerity is not the answer to navigating the changed economic landscape, but departments will have to make tough choices in the months ahead. These choices will be shaped by our commitment to review the Green Book. To properly level up the country, we must ensure that Treasury decision-making reflects our country's economic geography. Spending decisions cannot be based solely on cost-benefit ratios assessed in silos. There must be room for more balanced judgments which take account of the transformative potential of investment to reduce inequality and drive localised growth. Levelling up must also be more than a shifting of resource from London to other large metropolitan cities. It needs to work for the entire United Kingdom, including as part of our enduring commitment to the Union. And it must recognise that within a single bus journey, different neighbourhoods in the same area can often be worlds apart. Accelerating the UK's economic recovery, levelling up opportunity throughout our country, improving our public services, and making the UK a scientific superpower. These are the priorities the CSR must drive forward. And to do so, I am focusing on 3 areas which will shape our approach to the spending review. The first is outcomes. I want this review to tie expenditure and performance far more closely together than has been the case to now. For decades, the most innovative companies have made a habit of setting clear objectives and then relentlessly tracking, measuring, and evaluating the outcomes of their work. This approach should not just be confined to Silicon Valley. We must not forget that the public will judge success not by how much is spent, but by what they experience in their daily lives, the state of local roads, the time taken to get a hospital appointment, how safe the neighbourhood feels. If funding decisions are to improve over time, we in the Treasury need to have clearer sight of both the intended outcomes and subsequent evaluation of their delivery. We'll be publishing details on these outcomes at the spending review, thereby setting the priorities across government for the remainder of this Parliament. Another key challenge to measuring outcomes is the divide between policy and delivery. Bridging this divide is made even more difficult by the fact that some of the most complex policy challenges sit across multiple departments and arm's-length bodies. At last year's spending review, the government announced a new shared outcomes fund to test innovative ways of bringing together the public sector. The aim was to address cost-cutting issues in a way that improves outcomes and ensures value for money. I'm pleased to announce today that I have approved the first round of pilots from this fund. These pilots will use innovative approaches to address a wide variety of issues, from tackling drug misuse in some of the worst affected areas by better joining up local law enforcement agencies, healthcare and prisons, to planting trees outside woodlands to help meet our climate change targets, or supporting GPs and other healthcare professionals to refer patients to outdoor activities in their local communities to help manage complex health and social challenges like mental health and loneliness. While the various pilot schemes may seem eclectic, the one thing each successful bid has in common is it is backed by a robust method to track and measure the delivery of the outcomes. I'm hoping we can learn from the success of these projects. Indeed, we can learn from them even if they're not successful, because we'll have better data to understand why. Closely connected to outcomes is speed, my second area of focus. Speed is a hallmark of the digital era. Over half of mobile internet users will leave a site that takes longer than 3 seconds to load. The early response to CBILS, and the delivery of the bounce back loans shows government can adapt and deliver schemes that work at speed. When it comes to infrastructure, we must not only foster a culture of pace, agility and strong leadership, we must also learn from the work of the Infrastructure and Projects Authority and the National Audit Office. Programmes need to start with robust goals, and we have to resist the temptation to repeatedly change plans. Our maxim should be measure twice and cut once. That way we can better address the sobering fact that our capital costs are typically between 10 and 30% higher in this country than in other European countries. This is why a new infrastructure delivery task force has been established, known as Project Speed. Led by the Chancellor, Project Speed will aim to cut down the time it takes to develop, design and deliver vital projects. Another key element of building faster is utilising modern construction techniques linked to clearer standardisation across projects. I want to explore how the same principles of standardisation and modularisation that delivered the first Nightingale Hospital, one of the largest in the world, in just 9 days, can now help deliver the government's flagship commitment to build 40 new hospitals. It's not that government doesn't innovate when it comes to construction. It's just that the innovation is unevenly distributed. For example, how many of you are aware that the Department for Education has, over the last 7 years, brought the cost per metre squared of a new school down by 1/3? Yet government as a whole still has a long way to go in optimising the speed and value of the money of our construction spend. Take housing. 84% of detached housing in Sweden uses prefabricated timber elements. Here, by contrast, the figure is just 5%. No doubt it is still associated in people's minds with the Spartan post-war housing stock. But the modern reality is very different, as typified by the so-called Japanese dream factories, where a single factory can deliver around 20,000 units a year. Customers are able to personalise their future home to match their individual needs and aspirations, making buying a home closer to the experience of buying a car. This is what we should be seeing in the UK. Yet too often housing construction would look familiar to Victorian eyes. As a result, the spending review will seek to accelerate our adoption of modern methods of construction and explicitly link funding decisions to schemes that prioritise it. After outcomes and speed comes my third area of focus, data. The proliferation of information is the story of our age. As Onward's recent report, Data to the People, reminds us, more data was created in the last 2 years than in the previous 5,000. Yet despite its importance, too often we have been behind the curve when it comes to obtaining, analysing and enabling open access to data. At its core, we need to demonstrate how the better use of real-time data delivers a better service to the public. Take the National Shielding Programme as an example. By government departments coordinating and sharing data, the most vulnerable in our society were able to access the food and medicine they needed in a time of national crisis. Data also drives better government decision-making. I've already spoken about outcomes, but it's important we draw the distinction between the decisions we make and the outcomes those decisions generate. The quality of a decision won't necessarily match the quality of the outcome. In a world of imperfect information, we can never perfectly predict outcomes up front, but what we can do is improve the decisions we make. Yet it remains the case that decisions in government still rely heavily on spreadsheets from departments rather than data directly sourced in real time. Now, this is my first spending review, and I'm keen to learn from the past experience of my predecessors. But there's limited data available from previous spending rounds to use to provide useful insights. Evaluation is too often insufficiently prioritised by departments. A spending review should be an iterative process, not a standalone event. Ministers should not have to face an array of unconnected spending requests supported by differing standards of evidence, as is the case now. I recently heard an example here from last year's spending review, where a department had failed to provide standardised and comparable data sets to the relevant spending stream in the Treasury. In response, a member of our Treasury team, who happens to be a gifted coder, took it upon himself to quickly code a solution that harmonised the data sets. As a result, his team identified savings of £1.3 billion. That's great to see, but it shouldn't rely on the initiative of just one individual. This approach should be the norm. Work has therefore already begun to incentivise departments and, importantly, arm's-length bodies to supply higher quality standardised data and to support the Treasury to better interrogate this data. Now, a multi-year spending review allows for a deeper and more fundamental change. A new public infrastructure is emerging to govern how we collect, share and exploit the vast data sets which are generated as a byproduct of 21st century life. But building this will involve sorting out the data architecture as well as the data sets. Remember, the average tenure of a Secretary of State is less than 2 years. And so it's no surprise that issues such as legacy IT are often deprioritised in favour of the new and exciting. This is despite the fact that currently around half of central government IT is spent on servicing legacy IT. Such an approach is not only expensive, it also poses cybersecurity risks and prevents agile ways of working cross-departmental interaction. It also obstructs the use of new innovative IT solutions and the sharing of data more openly. That is why a key focus of the spending review will be addressing legacy IT and investing in the data infrastructure we need to become a truly digital government. Finally, we in the Treasury need to think differently about our own relationship with data and how we use it to make our decisions. Take, for example, the £225 million that the government is allocating to local transport authorities this year to invest in new walking and cycling infrastructure. The Government Digital Service and the Treasury have created a new tool to bring together disparate and novel data sets. The insights will support value for money decisions right away, but it will also help determine our approach to similar investment in the future as part of the £2 billion the Prime Minister has announced for cycling and walking. It could, for example, help us speed up delivery, reduce costs, or improve safety, or to ensure the development of cycle lanes is better spread to include those areas who have missed out in the past. And while this is a project in itself, we are using it as a test case of how we reform data use in the Treasury. Now, bringing together different data sets covering pay, pensions and property can also help determine future civil service workforce requirements, including which jobs we can move out of London. Similarly, improved data could help better match new police resources to crime in communities, or to track the vast amounts we grant to local authorities to spend on social care to ensure it better reaches those in need. So the possibilities are extensive and exciting. This is why I have established a small team of analysts and developers to provide more data science expertise and bring agile product practices to the Treasury, both in the lead up to the spending review and beyond. However, we must not be afraid to acknowledge the limits of data. Data can be biased and reductive, and alone it never tells the full story. It can help close the information gap, but we will almost always be making decisions with imperfect information to guide us. And it is in this vein I briefly turn to a final thought. Speeding up projects, measuring outcomes, using data to make better decisions represents a great opportunity. But setting ambitious goals and experimenting with ways of delivery increases the risk of government falling short. Indeed, we must accept that such an approach, one of starting small and failing fast, is an approach that will sometimes not deliver the outcomes we expect. The real failure will be to only ever play it safe and to never try anything new. So how will this autumn spending review bring these things together? It means departments sharing the data models and analysis that underpins spending proposals and rigorously agreeing outcomes with the Treasury as part of that process. Now, I don't pretend for a moment that data is a panacea. Data won't make the difficult decisions any easier. There will always be a place for political judgment. Nor do I pretend that we will get it right first time. This spending review is an opportunity to experiment with new ideas. If they work, we'll look to build on them in the future, and if they don't, we'll learn the lessons and move on. But coming as it does in the wake of a crisis that has fully tested the machinery of government, this spending review is a moment to ingrain a new approach into the public finances. Instead of being seen as a brake on progress, I want the Treasury to put its foot on the accelerator, to move beyond a simple yes-no approach to public spending, and instead bring together people, ideas, and best practices from inside and outside government. It's an opportunity for the Treasury to capture the can-do attitude shown by civil servants during the COVID pandemic and make it permanent, to be the new radicals leading change across government. Done well, we can move on from an era of spreadsheets. We can create a smarter and faster culture in Whitehall. And we can ensure that Britain does indeed bounce back from this crisis stronger and better than before.
Steve, thank you so much for that. And it's fantastic to be able to get an insight from you direct into how you're approaching the spending review and some of the new thinking that you're trying to drive into the Treasury, which, let's be honest, has never always been seen as a bastion of innovation and quite often had a reputation for orthodoxy. Yes. One idea that I'm going to abuse the chair for a moment and just ask you a question right off the back, and then I'm going to come to some of the questions that we've had streaming in on the Zoom. So my question is this. So I've worked in government, and I think more than anything, some of the challenges that you're describing are questions of culture. We know that startups, some of the Silicon Valley companies that you allude to, are known or are successful because they have a high degree of risk appetite. They have an ability and a willingness to cut corners, to bootstrap, to do things differently, and to fail fast and fail in pursuit of goals. And lots of that ambition is clearly there in your speech. But the civil service doesn't always have that culture. And so I guess my question is, how do you move from a civil service which is perceived as a kind of Rolls-Royce civil service to one that's a bit more Tesla, a bit more Elon Musk?
Well, I think what's interesting is both Tesla and Rolls-Royce have a culture of excellence driven by data. And I think one of the things that COVID has shown is the civil service does have a culture, as with the furlough scheme, as with self-employment income support scheme, where things can be delivered at pace. So I think it's not about a completely new culture. It's about how do we build on what we have seen in the culture in recent weeks. And I think that is that mix of being very clear on the outcome. So they measure twice, cut once. So one of the lessons from countless infrastructure reports, as you know from your time in government, was if projects are rushed too much at the front end, then that can lead to endless delays and change of specifications. So we've got to learn from the IPA in particular on that. But at the same time, I look at my own experience as to why certain schemes take so long. And often it's because consultants are writing very long reports, which few people read, and then they have another report, planning rules are having unintended consequences. So how do we inject speed into that decision making and then have the data in order that we can switch things off quickly as well as switch them on. And I think there's a lot within the culture of the civil service can be, but getting the right data enables to get that buy-in from people, and that's one of the things we're working on.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I'm going to turn to some of the questions that have been coming in, which are probably far more kind of pointed than some of my questions. So Hugo Guy, so I'm going to try and take journalist questions first if I can, and where I identify them. So Hugo Guy asks, will the outcome targets that you talk about be set by the Treasury or by Number 10? And what will be the consequences for departments in due course if those outcomes are not achieved?
Well, firstly, one of the features of this government is how closely Number 10, Number 11, and indeed the Cabinet Office are working. And I think that is one of the things that both I and the Chancellor spend a lot of time on. And so the outcomes will be agreed. So they'll be agreed at the centre, including with the Treasury. Formally, these things are done through the spending review. But then in terms of one of the reasons for the focus on evaluation is that tends to be the area that is most neglected at present. So the numbers of projects that are evaluated is far too low. And that's where this iterative approach, so that each spending review learns from its predecessor, is based. So I think the ability to switch off comes back to more real-time data. So are we getting data, for example, on the delivery of our housing from local authorities direct? How do we enhance that? From Homes England, what is the data within there? Is it all through MHCLG? What is the time lag? Is it this spreadsheet culture that we can move on and modernise from? And I think the ability to have more real-time data will then enable Treasury to challenge on outcomes, to look at the evaluation and to make quicker decisions.
Okay. There was a related question which came through earlier, which was regarding the kind of Blair Brown government and the use of data previously under Michael Barber in the Prime Minister's delivery unit. To what extent do you see this approach as an evolution or kind of reiteration of that approach, and indeed to what extent are you modelling some of these changes directly on the Michael Barber model, or is this a very different model to what was done?
Well, it's modelled much more on best practice in industry and commercially, and looking at California and looking at major companies and what they're doing with their technology and how they're getting oversight of their delivery projects. In terms of, if one goes back to New Labour and targets, there's aspects of this we can build on. The danger with targets is often it reinforces the silos within departments. So you've got the old adage of hitting the target, missing the point. This sense that you could hit an A&E target of seeing people within 4 hours, but actually, is that the right approach? Do you want lots of people turning up at A&E, or what are you doing upstream? So if ambulances are queuing at hospitals, is that because Cat 3 and Cat 4 patients who don't need to be at those A&Es could be at an urgent care centre instead? So you're measuring a target, but actually you're driving the wrong behaviours. So for me, part of the work we're doing through the Shared Outcomes Fund is looking at much more how an issue applies to lots of different departments. So I was speaking to Dame Louise Casey this morning, and the government has, I think, done a very successful thing in terms of getting people off the streets. But if you look at then the next phase and the delivery for those that are sleeping and homeless, that obviously interacts with the Department of Health. It interacts with a whole range of, it's not just simply a housing issue, it's a wraparound services issue. And so the concern with the New Labour targets approach is it often didn't capture the change of behaviour upstream that you really wanted to see.
Okay. Thank you, that's very helpful. So I'm going to take one of the journalist questions, Matt Dakin from The Sun.
Yes.
You'll know for it, but I'm sure. He's asked 2 questions. He wants me to ask you where you're going to go on holiday, but...
I'm staying in the fence, so in East Anglia. If that answers the people always accuse us politicians of not answering the question. Matt, that's a very clear answer for you.
But he's also asked about something I know The Sun is campaigning on at the moment, which is why is the government looking at what he calls a regressive flat tax on online sales that will hit the poorest the hardest?
As skillfully as I would expect, he tries to draw me into speculation on the budget, and obviously the Chancellor will come to that in due course. What we have signalled is that we're taking a three-phased approach. So the immediate approach to the COVID crisis was how do we retain that link through the furlough scheme? How do we address the cash flow pressures that businesses were under? That was that combination of the grants, the loans, the bounce back loan, the CBILS, the furlough scheme, the self-employment scheme, the support for local authorities. So then, with the summer economic update, we moved into that second phase of the plan, where the Chancellor set out the package, the plan for jobs, including the Eat Out to Help Out, the targeted measure VAT for the hospitality sector. And then the debate on the longer term fiscal position is one for the budget, and one sees various stories in the paper, but these are issues that will be brought forward at the budget as part of a wider discussion.
Didn't think you were going to be drawn on it, but you can but try. So the next question I was going to turn to is from Zoe Billingham from the Centre for Progressive Policy, who's asked to what extent you see levelling up as an agenda which relates to mayors and local authorities, and something in which kind of devolution can play a role. And I guess it's one of my questions as well, listening to you speak. You talked a lot about central government, but to what extent is this actually something that should be happening right across the public sector, including in local areas? It's
a really good question, and Simon Clark and Robert Gemma are doing quite a bit of work at the moment on that devolution space. And I think I remember speaking to George Osborne about the fact that when he brought forward the proposals on that, one of the things he envisaged was them being drivers of innovation. And I think one of the areas sometimes of confusion is exactly what is the mayor responsible for. You know, when you speak to constituencies, we have a devolved mayor in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, and so what is the mayor responsible compared to the county council, compared to the lower tier councils, police and crime commissioner, etc. So I think certainly I think there is scope to look at what data we're getting from mayors, how they're driving innovation, how they can tailor things. But I think one of the things one's got to watch with the levelling up agenda is I do see from time to time it very much talked about as a regional thing. And I think, and I see this at a constituency level, even within Cambridgeshire, my area in the Fens Wisbech is very different to Cambridge in terms of those that go to university, health outcomes and so forth. So one of the things with the levelling up agenda is it's not only looking at do we have the right number of officials around the UK? Should we have more officials in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland? Are there too many officials in London vis-a-vis elsewhere as people work more from home? Is that something colleagues in the civil service will want to embrace moving forward? So there's scope to look at that and link that in with the mayors, but levelling up needs to be more than just about the Manchesters and the Birminghams. It's also got to be about those areas that feel they're not getting the opportunities. We then get better data to show that when spending bids are coming in, which are those areas, and that's where it links in to the Green Book review. Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so we've just had another question just come in just now from Matt Honeycomb-Foster from Politics Home, seem to be a Politico. He argues, or he's asking, this isn't the first time ministers have talked about tracking outcomes and setting clear objectives. There's also fanfare about this in the coalition single departmental plans, which you will remember. Why have previous attempts at this kind of initiative stalled or failed? And you can ask whether or not they have. And how do you avoid big spending departments whose focus is on running day-to-day services, just focusing on that and shrugging off this kind of firstly, it's a fair point, and there are programs like Verify that have tried to do some of these things in the past. But I think, in essence, I start with pointing to your report, which talks about just how much data there has been over the last couple of years. You look at what technically can be done, the number of software platforms. I've been speaking with various software firms in recent weeks, and so the capability, what companies can do with the data, I think is very different compared to where we were 5, certainly 10 years ago. The other thing, and this is one of the things I hope I sought to bring out in my remarks, is we also have to be prepared to look at legacy IT systems much more than I think has been the case in the past. So if I was to single, in answer to your question, one specific change of focus in this SR, is I think a lot of the data IT requests that have come in the past have tended to be for new things, rather than fixing the legacy IT. And the point about that, and I think the point that sometimes is missed with the legacy IT, is it's not about replacing the old system with a newer version of it. It's about saying, how do we then work in more agile ways? And it very much ties into this point around breaking down the department silos, so that the customer journey for members of the public with government becomes easier, but also we'll start to be able to interrogate the data across department. And you can't do that unless you fix the legacy IT. So I think, in answer to the question, one of the big changes in this SR is unblocking that, which in turn enables lots of innovative IT to be plugged in a different way.
And so you mentioned data, and you mentioned our report, and thank you for reading it. It's really interested in it, and for mentioning it on this platform. But one of the things that we try and draw out in there is the potential for open data to be transformative in terms of the way in which government uses information and actually allows people to build innovation on top of large-scale public sector data sets and leverage some of that asset that we have in the UK that perhaps other countries don't have. We've had a question from Charlotte Aldrich, who asks the extent to which some of these plans also include a kind of opening up of data, a kind of open data. Is that very much part of your thinking?
Yeah, very much, because I think, firstly, I think it has a galvanising effect, particularly internally. I know Matt Hancock got quite a lot of criticism at the time when he came out with the testing target. But I think even his critics would accept that it had a galvanising effect on the system. And so I very much support that. But also because by being more open with the data, it enables people to come up with ideas and solutions that internally won't have been considered.
Yeah.
And I think that's where a lot of, again, this is part of the approach to looking at business cases in a slightly different way. Because if you're looking at purely a legacy IT program, some of those potential benefits are quite hard to capture because you don't know what issues people will bring forward. So it's the enabling element of government that we want to bring through.
Okay. We've had another question from Alex Morales from Bloomberg, and you mentioned the furlough scheme in your speech. This may be a question which you can't give a direct answer to right now, but he's asking, does the Treasury envisage having to help out certain very badly hit sectors beyond the end of the furlough scheme, or is that completely off the table given the huge risks to job losses in hospitality, leisure, travel, even given the assistance that you've already rolled out?
Well, the Chancellor has been very clear when this issue has been raised in the House of Commons, in that if one understands the rationale behind the furlough scheme, it was about retaining the link with the job. And actually, if you stretch the elastic of that too long, then people start to lose their skills, they lose contact, and it's not good for them, actually. Never mind, the debate on the financial side of it. For people to be out of the labour market for too long a period is not a good outcome, which is partly why in the summer economic update there was so much focus on the doubling of the work coaches, the tripling of the traineeships, the 2 billion for the Kickstarter scheme, to ensure that we don't have people out of the labour market. So it would be odd to have such a focus on retaining the link to jobs and ensuring people aren't out of the labour market, and then to have a scheme that was extended in a way that perpetuated that. So no, the Chancellor will be very clear that the furlough scheme won't be extended. Now that doesn't mean, as he showed with the support that he and Oliver Dowden put in place for the arts with the £1.57 billion support package, that targeted measures won't be taken where there is a strong business case for doing so, but that is distinct from extending the furlough scheme.
Okay, thank you. So Daniel Dipper asks, is there a risk that by setting targets that may be ambitious, so not always be achieved, that voters' expectations will increase and delivery will not rise to that? And I assume potentially leading to an even greater loss of confidence than we've already seen into post-government, and how will you manage that issue? Yeah. That is potentially quite difficult.
It is, and in a way I tried to signal that in my remarks, in that I think we do need to try and open up a different conversation. And in a way there was an echo of this when we were pressed as ministers as to have you in your health guidance specified every scenario. And the Prime Minister said, no, we're trusting the British people. And actually I got a very different response when I was talking to my constituents, who were very receptive to that position from the Prime Minister, and they said, yes, we're responsible employers, we want to look after our staff, we will make sensible decisions. We don't need the government to set out every single scenario there. And I think there's a similar challenge with the debate on setting more ambitious metrics in terms of outcomes. But I think unless we set ambitious outcomes, then it's not delivering its objective. I think you have to have stretching on metrics, but have a grown-up conversation with people as to the fact that they won't all be met, but you will learn, and government will learn from the process by stretching itself in that way. I think the alternative would be far worse, which is to set very limiting objectives and hit them.
Yeah. Yes, government success, that is real success. Okay, so a slightly different topic here, but I think and it's all within this, clearly the contents of your speech, and sort of focusing on some of these big issues. So Anthony Nordberg has asked a question really about capital. So you've talked about data, you've talked about how the government uses information. He's asking, would the Treasury consider taking up a role of equity shareholder in cooperative private public projects? And apart from getting the return on those investments, could those interests be aligned between the partners and government in a way that couldn't be gained by the private sector and could just genuinely deliver public sector outcomes?
Well, as the former Financial Services Minister, I couldn't say never on the basis of what happened with RBS and some other sectors of financial services. But I think our starting point should be, what is government best able to add value on? Yeah. And I think in terms of those investment decisions, it is best done by the private sector. Now, there was a debate on in terms of the various loans of support in response to COVID and what happens to those, and there's any of that shift to equity, and that's a point, for example, the chairman of the Treasury Select Committee, Mel Stride, has raised. So of course, there's always debates on these things, but ultimately, I think those sort of investment decisions are best taken in the private sector. But of course, sometimes, as we saw in 2008, there are responses which take a different course.
Okay. Richard Possington from The Guardian is interested in what you said about austerity and what the Prime Minister has said about austerity and how that relates to the letters that went out to departments about the spending review. So he says, you say that the government will not use austerity in response to the crisis. Why does the CSR instruct departments to show restraint on future public sector pay awards? Is that not incongruous? And he's also asking, what do you say to the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, who say that closing the furlough scheme is a mistake?
Well, on the second one, on closing the furlough, I think we've addressed that, which is we don't think it's the right thing for people to be outside of the labour market for very long periods. And 8 months is a long period of itself. So to some extent, if you extended, someone would then say 10 months isn't enough, 11 months isn't enough. So there'd never be a point at which there. So that addresses that. On the issue of the CSR letter, what we've said to departments is, first of all, budgets will increase in real terms. But of course, and I think most people would accept, there's a lot of volatility around how the reopening of the economy will go. And therefore, to set precise envelopes this time would be extremely challenging, because you don't know the extent of local lockdowns and what will happen. And the pace at which things can move, we've seen this week in terms of Spain. So numbers can move very quickly. But what I would say in particular on pay is you will have seen the settlements announced over the last week or two, where we have actually recognised the very significant contribution of our public services in response to COVID, and that was reflected in the pay awards we've just announced.
Okay. I'm going to return to something that we touched on earlier, because it's come up again in a number of questions, which is local communities and local areas. So we talked about devolution. Rayhan Haq from Local Trust, which is a big endowment which does lots of work in left behind communities and has actually done quite a lot of work to identify left behind communities. Is asking to what extent the government would consider kind of big, bold, radical policy choices like setting up a community wealth fund to invest directly in communities and to be held outside government, investing in social infrastructure and other types of activity in left behind places.
Well, the whole title of the speech is to be more radical, and the challenge that we're setting, the Chancellor and I are setting with colleagues in the building, is building on what has been delivered in COVID, the pace at which Hisham RC and Treasury colleagues reacted, and therefore challenging in the building on that. So virtually where radical proposals, then the question then is, well, what is the data? What is the outcome being sought? What is the data to support that? How will we evaluate it? And how do we therefore get a better view? And one of the challenges, in a way, if one looks at local decisions from the Treasury impacting local areas, it is often around the data. So you will have seen in March that the Treasury allocated 1.6 billion, which was more towards the upper tier authorities. And then the following month, we allocated further 1.6 billion, which was more towards the lower tier. But in terms of the ability of central government to actually see where the pressures were on revenue, where the increasing demand was, for example, Westminster Council would be hit, or Stratford and Avon Council would be hit by loss of income on its car parking. Whereas in my constituency in Fenland, the local council doesn't charge for its car parking. So you get these very different localised impacts. And therefore, when one wants to target the measures, whether on a new proposal or existing spend, such as the 600 million that went on infection control through councils into care homes, the question then comes back is how are we actually tracking that? How are we measuring it? Is it delivering what was initially said? And ultimately, all of this ties back, and at every stage we have to tie it back to the member of public. So for the consumer, for the constituents, because ultimately government can keep announcing we spent this much, but it's what experience someone has, and that's why we want to tie much more to the outcomes. So if you had a fund like that, what is the outcome that is going to deliver? Because otherwise you end up with a situation like, for example, with the local enterprise partnerships, where very large sums was allocated. Some did a brilliant job, some didn't. Some let the money just sit in accounts for years. And so you can set up a fund, but the question is, what is the outcome it delivers?
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. But when you were talking, I was reminded of perhaps a profitable story of the CEO of Barclay, I think it was, who used to have, as I understood it, an app on an iPad that would tell him not just how profitable every branch in the country was, but also how many people were queuing at any time. Which seems to me like the type of place that you're trying to potentially get to, sitting in the Treasury, understanding which the local government departments are delivering what outcomes. Okay, there's another question which has come up, which is more about the ability for schemes to serve everyone. So the question is, to what extent can government, when it's rapidly designing some of these policy mechanisms, ensure that people don't fall through the cracks, that people don't get left behind? And the question alludes to some of the schemes which have been set up in recent months, where the Chancellor and others have acknowledged that not everyone was covered, but there was a need to set things up quickly. Have you reflected on that? Are there things that government can do to ensure that that people don't fall through the cracks, or is that a necessary byproduct of some of the innovation you described?
Well, I think the debate which the Treasury Select Committee and others have covered, it was between the pace of getting support out to businesses, and in particular because of cash flow pressure that many were under, and using the architecture that we had in place. But what I think the Chancellor would say if he was here is that other schemes then also related. So if someone didn't fall within the scope of one scheme, then there are often others. So part of the reason for the additional investment in universal credit, the removal of the minimum income floor, the changes on housing allowance, the increase of £20 a week on the standard rate, and so forth, was to say if people didn't, and over 9.5 million fell within the furlough scheme, so it covered a huge number of people. But for those outside of that, what are the other things that would apply? But I think a lot of this then comes back to the data point. And so perhaps a better example for me would be going through COVID, how do we ensure that those people who were shielding aren't left behind, who couldn't go to the shops? What is it government could do? And there, what was interesting for me was we had to take data from quite a range of data sets to identify something was a clear benefit for the end person. So this was in the recipient's interest, but we weren't geared up to provide that up front. And I think there's an important lesson there as to all of this, I think, comes back to how is the outcome better for the individual.
Yes.
And that's a very obvious one. They get a food box once a week. That means they don't have to put themselves at risk going out. They can get their essential medicine delivered. And I think the key with this is the data will better point to who is covered and who is not. And that then allows those much more targeted measures that ties back in from a Treasury point of view to value for money. Because when proposals come to myself and the Chancellor, one of the issues, as you will know, Will, is what's the dead weight? Is it really delivering for the people that the department claims it is? And that's where that link of the data, the speed of deployment, and the focus on outcomes comes together.
Okay, we've got 2 minutes left, so I'm going to try and squeeze in 2 questions. The first of which is both very specific, so hopefully there'll be a quick answer. The first is from Chris McLaughlin, who's asking whether or not the government intends to increase its interest in the UK space industry following the investment in OneWeb. And so I don't know if you had any particular comment on that question.
Well, the wider approach to space fits within 2 different. You've got the industrial strategy element of that through Alexandra and Bayes, and then you've also got the integrated review in terms of how that fits within our defence capabilities, where space is a part of that. But I think the direction of travel is, we are investing 22 billion in our R&D, a massive increase, and there's a very strong focus on that. And clearly, there's a link between R&D and our commitment to space. So I would expect to be doing more in the wider area, but obviously individual schemes looked at on their merits.
Very good. And then the final question is Matt Dathan, who is very persistently trying to ask a second question, which is...
Yes, 2 first-time members, so...
which is, indeed. Well, to be fair, the holiday question was related to this, which is to what extent do you consider a cut to air passenger duty in order to stimulate the tourism sector and to support aviation?
Well, I don't think the problem is necessarily a fiscal one at the moment in terms of could people afford their ticket. I think it's more a safety one, which is people are reluctant to fly. So I think going back to the point I said a moment ago about dead weight within a proposal, what I'd want to understand there is, of course, there's a separate debate on APD at any one point, which we could have. But if it's more in the context of a response to COVID, then we have taken measures in terms of support, for example, in Northern Ireland to ensure that airport connectivity is remained. We've taken measures on ferries, for example, with the Isle of Wight and the Isle of Scilly. So again, we've always been open-minded on these things. But I think on a specific tax proposal, firstly, obviously, it's for the budget. Sure. But secondly, when you would assess that, I think one would want to know, is the issue driven by the health concerns and people's perceived risk of that, or is it on the affordability of the flight? And that would be the sort of area that I would want to throw.
Okay, fantastic. Well, we've run out of time and you've been incredibly generous with your thoughts and your time, so thank you very much, Steve. And if I could just also say thank you to everyone who tuned in today, and I look forward to engaging with you in the future at future Onward events. But thank you very much, and I'll see you very soon.